Before we really talk about composition, let's break things down a bit and simply talk about messages. This is a core component of object-oriented design. So we've already reviewed the essentials, like class, person. But it stands to reason that our person will have some kind of job. So they will work for a business. So how can we represent that as code? Well, I said business, and at least at the early stages, we've learned to hunt for the nouns. So maybe we'll have some kind of class business. And if we want to make our code as readable as possible, then maybe we could use terminology like this. The business hires a person. And when they do, that person joins the staff. So there we go. There's another term. Maybe we have a staff. So why don't we flesh this out a bit more? For our person, we're simply going to give them a name. And from now on, I have a little macro here that'll speed things up a bit. And that will simply assign the name to a protected property. Next, we talked about a business hiring a person. So that means we could have a hire method. Now, who are we hiring? Well, we are hiring a person, but we can actually take this a little bit further. If I want to say that the expected value that will be passed to this method should be of type person, then we can make use in PHP of what we call type hinting. We can do that by simply adding the object name here. So now this means if we try to hire a person, but we pass in the string foo here, well, in that case, an error will be thrown. And also, as a little aside here, it makes our code that much more readable. Business hire a person. Now, here's the first step where you start learning a little bit more about architecture and how we want to design these objects. For example, should the business be responsible for keeping track of the person? Well, in some cases, maybe the answer is yes. And then in other cases, well, very much the answer could be no. Or in other words, ask yourself this. Should the business be responsible for handling and tracking its staff? And if the answer is no, then it might make sense to create a separate class, maybe something like staff. But now, how would we represent that here? Really what I want to say is add person to the staff collection. Well, here's what we'll try. When we start a new business, we need to have some kind of staff, right? If I want to start Lyricast, well, at least to begin things, I will be one of the workers. And if we hire somebody else, that person will be added to the staff. So that means if a business depends upon a staff in order to exist, then I will require that within my constructor. We need to provide a staff when we create a new business. Notice how readable that is. And here, once again, we will use our macro here to assign the staff to this protected property. So now I want you to notice that we're not just dealing with single classes here. In a real application, you'll have lots and lots of classes. And these objects you have will send messages to one another. For example, in the case of hire, if I want to add person to the staff collection, well, I can defer to my staff object. And remember, at this point, this staff property will be equal to a new instance of staff. So now, what kind of message do I want to send? Well, how about something like add? Add to your staff this person. Now, here's the benefit to that. By taking a little bit of time to actually think about the naming here, many times we can make our comments redundant. And if you've ever seen on the web somebody remark that comments are an anti-pattern, usually this is what they're referring to. If you instead code in a smart fashion, in many cases, mind you, not all, but in many cases, we can make the comment redundant. And whenever that happens, it's a good sign that you're on the right track. So if I want to reference an add method, that means we need to provide it. Add, and we will accept a person here. Now, in this case, staff will sort of serve as a collection here. So maybe we'll have a protected members, and that will be equal to an array. And when the add method is called, I will simply say this members add a new person. All right, so this is starting to look pretty good. Already, you've learned a few new things, such as type hinting and sending messages. So in use, let's see what this might look like. To begin, we need some kind of person. And why don't we use the case of Laracast here? I am a person, so we will instantiate person and pass through my name. Great. Next, we have a new business here, so I need to create that. We'll call this Laracast, and that's a new business. But don't forget, we specified that a business depends upon its staff in order to run. That makes sense, right? So that means we need a staff object as well. So let's say staff equals a new staff, and then we will pass that in to our business. Now, before we continue on, I want to return to this word depends. That's very important. As you learn more, you'll hear people talk about this concept over and over. How many dependencies does this object have? Does this class have too many dependencies? Or is this class tightly coupled to something else? Or is it loosely coupled? All of these various terms and concepts revolve around the basic idea of a dependency. Now, in this case, it's fair to say that the business depends upon a staff in order to run. So for now, file that one away. All right, so we have a person, we have a staff, and we have a new business. Next, the business is going to hire me. So we represent that in as readable a way as we're capable. Remember, when you're writing code, the goal is never, ever to make it as confusing and abbreviated as possible. Instead, do the exact opposite. How can we make this code as readable and intuitive as we possibly can? So in this case, when I say Laracast hire Jeffrey, that makes perfect sense. I bet I could even show this code to a little boy or girl, and they would get a basic idea of what's happening. That's the key. So now, if we did everything correctly, at this point, staff should be equal to one person. Let's check it out. var dump staff. And if we execute this from the terminal, there you go. One person works for Laracasts. Now let's continue on this track though. Maybe it makes sense that when you instantiate a new staff object, well, maybe you want to add people right away. And to do that, we simply use the constructor once again. Members, and then we assign that. This members equals members. But now there's one problem here. If we run this again, everything's going to fail. And that's because now we've specified that you absolutely cannot create a new staff object unless you pass through the members. And you know what? In some cases, that might be intended behavior. This is where you really need to understand the thing that you're working with. Is it okay to have a staff that doesn't consist of members? And if the answer is yes, then what we could do is default to an array. And as we've already reviewed, that means, yes, you can pass through some staff members if you want, but I don't require it. If you don't give me anything, I'm just going to default to an array. And that way, if we run this again, we don't get any errors. So that means now we could clean this up a little bit. Create a new staff, and it will consist of Jeffrey, at least to start. And really, if you think about it, in this context, that makes sense. Laracast is my business, so we didn't start the business and hire me. I'm connected to it, so we should add that by default. That means I can remove this entirely, but if we run it, we still get the same thing. Now, maybe we can hire somebody else. Let's do it. Laracast hire a new person, Jane Doe, and I will just inline this for convenience. And now if we run it, we should have two people on our staff. Now, in this case, we're just var dumping the staff object. But maybe if we go back to our business, this is sort of our manager class, maybe we want to have some way to quickly fetch the staff. Well, I could say get staff members, and that will simply return this staff. And how about members? Okay, we need to add that method. When we call members, this is sort of like a getter, but we are omitting the get. And really, once again, this sort of comes down to preference. People sort of split down the middle on this one. Some would say if it's a getter, you always add the get keyword. That's a convention you always follow. However, other people might say, no, it's superfluous. It's much more readable if I change that to members. So like everything, you just need to play around with both and make up your own mind. In this case, all we're going to do is return the array of members. All right, so let's try it out. We now don't want to var dump our staff. We want to get the members, or the staff members, off the Laracast object. Laracast get staff members. And if we run this again, we should get the same thing, and we do. So I think that's going to do it for this lesson. This has really been your first introduction to the idea of building up a suite of classes and having these classes interact with one another by sending various messages. When we want to add a person to our staff, we send a message add. Or if we want to fetch all of the members in our staff, then we can send a message of members. That's exactly what I mean when I use that term message. It's how objects communicate with each other.